My name is Meg O'Connor. I am a patient from Louisiana, and some of you may know me as the person who was super obsessed with the ghost at the Davenport Hotel last night. But believe it or not, that is not what FSBPT asked me to come here and talk to you about, even though if anyone has any questions about the ghosts, got a lot of fun facts. But I'm here to tell a different story, and I'm not a PT or a regulator, so you can imagine that this is a little intimidating. So even though I know that you just had a big, delicious lunch, I just ask that everyone please send some good energy my way as I tell you my story, and give me some smiles and good vibes up here, please. And I will notice if you fall asleep, and yes, this is an overt guilt trip. So over the years, I have had a great deal of physical therapy, and I won't go into all the medical details of why, but I have a progressive condition that threatens to cramp my style. Luckily, my style is pretty hard to cramp, but it is defined by a certain grace and agility that I think is currently speaking for itself, is it not? So, yeah, I need a lot of PT. Luckily, about 5 years ago, I found a physical therapist that I really clicked with and was really, really exceptional at his job. I, of course, had told my neurologist that I don't really mind falling because I always get up again, and I even told her I'm really good at falling, but somehow that just got me a prescription for even more PT. And so at that point, I was just relieved that I found someone that was so exceptional and that I got along with so well. I felt that we had a genuine rapport. We had a shared dark sense of humor, we both loved Stranger Things, and he had all the traits of a practitioner that I would look for in any clinician, really. He was analytical, creative, compassionate, and because he was such a good provider and because we got along, I actually loved going to PT. And if you're a PT sitting in the room, I'm sure you can attest to the fact that every single patient says that. We all love it, no one ever complains. So he was a very good provider who educated me about a lot of things and really helped me learn about my own condition and improve. And one of the things he taught me about that I really understood and he got my full buy-in on was the role that the mind and the body play with each other and how important stress and life events can be on a person's prognosis and how they're feeling. And that made a lot of sense. And so I was always really, really honest with him about what was going on in my life and sort of where the climate of my emotions were on any given day, because we had a good therapeutic alliance and it felt like it just strengthened that, to have that honesty and authenticity. So over these 5 years, I got really used to being candid with him. And this was not hard to do because we started every session in his private treatment room behind a closed door. And he was the only one listening, and we got along and I trusted him. And he even knew what to ask me about, kind of like a television show where you've seen all the prior episodes and you know exactly where you're picking up from. So for instance, when I had my annual, always chaotic trip back to my hometown for Christmas, he knew exactly how loaded that was. And so in my next session, he asked, how did it go this year? What happened this year? And I said, whatever you're thinking, it's even juicier than that. You're never gonna believe it.
Wait, Meg, I don't know what you're going to say next. I don't know what you're planning on saying next, but I just want you to know you can often be rich here, and this could be on YouTube. So I just want to caution you of that. Excuse me, I didn't mean to
Thank you. Yeah. No. I mean, it's a good story, but I don't even know these people, and I think half of them are in a food coma. We can't trust them. Oh gosh, but I mean, that's the whole point. 5 years of trust, exactly like Nancy's saying. Can't tell you guys, I don't want it on YouTube, but it's almost a slip. But I really trusted him, and it was no big deal to tell him what happened at Christmas. And as time went on, I continued telling him things, and the Christmas example is a little silly, but there were some serious things too. I was getting a pretty major diagnosis and processing what that meant for me. And of course, he was one of the people involved in that. And after 250 appointments or so with this person, he had earned that trust. I trusted him holding the gait belt, I trusted him with his dry needles, and I trusted him with how I felt about what was going on with my medical prognosis. But one day in his private treatment room, as I was talking to him openly, I suddenly looked over his shoulder and I noticed something a little different on his screen. It immediately caught my attention, and my stomach twisted, and honestly, I immediately just felt ill. And I said, "Are you recording me?" And he explained that this was an AI scribe tool that would listen to our conversation and create a note for him to save him time and reduce the burden of documentation and help with clinical care. I was shocked. I was just floored.
Meg? I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm a little bit of an ethics nerd here, and I'm a little concerned. I mean, you trusted him. How did you feel when you found out that this was happening? Did you kind of freak out?
I did kind of freak out. All of the stories that I had told him over the years, when he finally admitted that he had actually been doing this for 3 months without telling me, which I mentioned we both like Stranger Things. I did the math. It's almost exactly equivalent to the entire season 1 of Stranger Things being recorded without your knowledge. And what had felt like a safe space where I had a genuine one-on-one connection, it suddenly felt The robot's on the screen? Oh. No, it isn't.
He's there.
I didn't even notice him. I was waiting to tell you guys how creepy it would be if there were a robot in the room watching. And I knew it was going to pop up on the screen. And again, I didn't even notice the robot was there, which ironically proves the entire point, which is I had no idea something was listening. I thought this was a genuine one-on-one connection. And it turns out there'd basically been this other presence in the room the entire time that I didn't know about. So I asked him, "Didn't you need to tell me?" And he said that Louisiana is a one-party consent state, which means that it is actually legal to record someone without their knowledge. And so no, he hadn't done anything illegal by recording all of these sessions in his private treatment room without telling me. And I said, "But is it ethical?" And at that point, it got a little awkward because I'm not sure that was a conversation he really wanted to unpack in this treatment room with a patient, while we were still being recorded, by the way, by the ambient listening scribe. He felt a little defensive, I think, understandably, and the conversation veered into, he said if I was comfortable telling him in a private treatment room, this should be no different, because the transcripts lived on his computer, at which point I said, "Transcripts?" And it started dawning on me how much information could have just been produced by this tool. And I didn't even really know yet what it might be. When he said transcripts, I realized it wasn't just recordings, it had all been written down. And all of these stories, some of them were embarrassing, some were private, and some were incriminating. The next day, I woke up with hives all over my face, which my friends still affectionately call the betrayal hives, and we talk about the betrayal hives frequently. But it wasn't actually just about the betrayal hives or the emotional impact of suddenly realizing someone I had trusted had done something without my consent or my knowledge. It was also a concern about what was now happening to all of this private information I had willingly shared, but under a different set of assumed circumstances. I knew he was incorrect when he said that these transcripts lived only on his computer. And the way I knew that was, I don't know if anyone here has ever tried to play a modern computer game on an old computer, but you will hear it revving like it's trying to take off to Mars, and then you're afraid it's gonna blow up. And if anyone has ever had that experience, imagine an AI ambient listening tool and the amount of computing power that is required to generate that kind of analysis. It wasn't happening locally. But the problem was, I didn't know where it was happening. I didn't actually know who was doing the processing of that data. And maybe a lot of patients wouldn't care, but I did. I had a lot of questions. Who had it? Where is it being stored? For how long? Who can access it? And is it now part of my medical record? Which was a basic question that my provider could not answer in the moment, but made a giant difference to me as the patient. I pushed a little harder. I was assured that the third-party business associate was HIPAA compliant, which is great. My provider also said that a couple other patients had noticed, but didn't freak out. And I think he was almost waiting for me to apologize for asking these questions.
So I'm a little confused here. I mean, he's answering the questions. Were his answers reassuring to you at all?
No, because I guess the part that maybe he wasn't remembering is that I'm a data scientist in my day job. So I was sort of wearing two hats here, and maybe that was a little sneaky of me. But these questions I was asking were not coming from a place of paranoia or conspiracy theories. They were coming from a place of deep concern based on what I know of how data can be handled in certain circumstances. So I didn't totally freak out, but I also wasn't reassured by his answers. I started asking even more questions. I called my sister, who's a nurse, and I told her what happened and said, is this normal to not tell patients and to record the equivalent of Stranger Things season 1, but their life, and then send it out to the airwaves? And my sister assured me, no, don't worry. These companies record this data, they collect the transcript and the audio, but then they make the SOAP note for the provider, which is what the provider needs, and they destroy the rest. They don't need the rest. They have to store it for a little while so that they can double check that the note is accurate and they can go back and reference it, but they don't need to keep all that stuff. They destroy it. And I said, oh, okay, well, that sounds a lot better than sort of the horror story I was imagining in my head. Let me just double check that that is what's happening here. So I went back to my provider and I said, can you just confirm that this is what's going on? Because we weren't able to answer my questions. And if all my extra stuff is getting destroyed, I still wish you had told me, but I don't know, I can live with that. I can fall asleep at night. But he still couldn't answer my questions. And eventually I got, I think, annoying enough, purely annoying enough, that he emailed the company and he asked the questions for me. And I was really, really hoping to get some reassuring answers. Do you think I did, Nancy?
So let me just ask you a question. I'm having a little bit of a privacy confidentiality moment here. Mm-hmm. He did actually delete everything, right? I mean, everything got deleted? You felt comfortable?
Well, so I hadn't asked yet at this point. What happened was I first wanted the answers to these questions, and I was really hoping that it would line up with what I was hearing from the industry as best practices.
But there's already stuff out there that, APTA put out a practice advisory about how to use ambient AI. So was he able to resource that at all?
He didn't know that existed. The questions we ended up getting back from the company just deepened my concerns. What I learned really shocked me. They store the full transcripts and the full audio for every patient for a default of 10 years. And they do not de-identify it, which means that my name and my provider and clinic's name stayed associated with the data for a default of 10 years. They also comply with subpoenas and legal discovery. So I called someone I knew, another family relative who was a lawyer, and I said, I'm sort of starting to freak out. There are hundreds of hours of me talking without knowing that I was being recorded, stored by a company that's going to keep it for 10 years, that if I'm in a car wreck in 8 years and it somehow turns into a court case, it sounds like these full conversations could be pulled. Would a lawyer ever read that? And his face lit up, and I know there's at least one attorney in the room, so I don't want to speak for all attorneys, but his face lit up, and he said, I would read every detail, every word, over and over and over. And that's when this nightmare deepened. I learned that they use human reviewers, and I also learned that the algorithm cannot necessarily differentiate between clinically relevant data and flippant social emotional data. So every joke I told him, every dark, weird joke or reference I made in that treatment room that I knew made sense to him because we vibed, this algorithm could interpret in any way it wanted to and meld into my SOAP note. And hopefully he would go through, and if it said anything wild about me, he would presumably take it out before he signed it. But it was still really concerning to me that something innocuous I said might be carried over from session to session and potentially impact my treatment. But I also got scared for my PT as well, because if he hadn't told me, I knew that he probably hadn't told any of his patients. And when I learned that the data was stored for 10 years as a default, and I started thinking about how that raises the possibility of a breach. And if a breach did happen, the provider must inform his patients. I don't know, Nancy, you have been a clinician. I think putting myself in the clinician's shoes here, I might have freaked out.
I would certainly have been rather nervous, but I'm just curious, and as a clinician, I have to admit this is way out of my area. I really don't know. But why would a company even want to put themselves in that position and have that kind of risk of saving that data for that long?
That's a good question, Nancy, and I asked the same one. I think this does really open up a lot of risk for the provider and the patient, and so I wouldn't want to store any more data than I had to, for any longer than I had to, unless there was a reason that I wanted the data and maybe it balanced out, the risk balanced out. So without going into, it could be a whole talk why any given company might end up keeping data for this long, but maybe you've heard the saying that data is the new oil. And I think that's just something to keep in mind here, that it, in this modern era, is an extremely valuable resource. Also, not all of these companies, I learned, are actually healthcare companies predominantly. When we have EMRs, we assume that the companies that are creating those EMRs are predominantly working in healthcare and HIPAA-protected spaces. But some of these scribe companies, especially if you picture smaller startups or they're often operating in this cross-sector way in many, many different domains. And they're also working in healthcare. So I got scared. I got scared for me and I got scared for my provider. And Nancy asked, did I get my data deleted? Well, I asked, and I even tried to call the scribe company and talk shop a little bit. How many servers do you have? Are you going to delete the metadata? Have you already derived insights from my data? And can you delete those derived insights? Who have you given the derived insights to? I had a lot of questions that I wanted an answer, potentially even from the company. But they said that they do not and cannot speak to patients for privacy reasons, and that if I wanted my data deleted, I had to go to my provider. So I went back to my provider, who very kindly reassured me again that everything was HIPAA compliant and that it wasn't illegal that he had recorded me in a one-party consent state. And I said, yes, yes. And he said, they're there. And I said, could you please ask them to delete everything? So they sent a form. And he said, look, this is going to be easy. Just sign this form and we're good. But then I read the form. And there was a clause on the form that said that this company does not commit to ever deleting patient data from its archival disaster recovery storage server. So I did not sign the form. I amended the form, and I gave it back to my PT clinic. And then they thought I was insane, and then the company thought they were insane. And it turned into there was a whole rung of power dynamics. And I was at the very, very, very bottom, begging my clinician to please, please, please ask about the disaster archive. But then I was not privy to the answer they were getting from the tech company, only they were privy to the answer. And then they were paraphrasing it to me. But then I have a data background, and I would say, that doesn't make any sense. Could you please ask this question? And it went back and forth like this for about a month, and eventually I got verbal confirmation that my stuff is gone. So yay, I guess. But all of this taught me that there are potentially some regulatory gaps here, and maybe some educational gaps. All of these terms are specified in something called a business associate agreement, or BAA, and that can also be negotiated. And in this attempt to kind of help my provider and maybe try to bury the bodies, or whatever I was trying to do Wild West style before I turned into the person who's sitting here, this can all be negotiated and changed. And I think if my provider had known that, he might have looked at the business associate agreement and maybe protected my data a little and prevented something like this. But I know this is very complicated, and the data stuff gets really super complicated, and it's hard to expect people to know it if they are specialized in another field. How do they balance all that? And our PT is equipped to understand and negotiate the BAAs currently, or recognize safe versus unsafe data practices. I also wondered, is it really okay that he recorded me without telling me? Because as a patient, I don't know, he was telling me it was okay, but something in my gut told me that that's not how it should work. So for a while, I just screamed into the void, and nothing happened until finally my email reached the desk of our very own Charlotte Martin, who is now officially a certified big deal after that awards ceremony. And she'll speak more about where we went from there, but that is the beginning of my story.
Meg, thank you for sharing your story. Really appreciate that. Like you heard from the legislators this morning, data is important, and so are our patient stories. They may not want to hear that story, but they might want to hear the successes and what we learned from that story. So let's pause and talk a little bit about this technology. The recent JAMA report on AI indicate that there are clinical, business administrative, direct-to-consumer, and hybrid models of AI in healthcare. How many of you guys own an Amazon Echo? Where you say, hey Siri, or I'm sorry, hey Alexa, right? Did you know that when you use that wake word, Alexa or Siri, it may or may not listen and record, depending on your privacy settings? In the same AMA report, 2/3 of physicians surveyed use health AI. It is up to 66% from 38% in 2023. And the top 3 reasons for using AI include documentation of billing codes, medical charts and visits, which are up 21% from 13%, creation of discharge instructions and treatment notes and progress notes, as you mentioned, up to 20% from 14%, and lastly, transcription of services at 14% from 11%. In physical therapy and other health professions, these AI ambient tools are now being advertised in APTA sections and academies, like private practice section, and on social media. What Meg is describing, obviously, as she articulated, these AI tools listen to the conversation with natural language processing and machine learning algorithms in large language models to create that physical therapist note. Usually, transcription of various languages to English and noise in space, like in this room, can be minimized in order to accommodate in those AI notes. However, as we heard, and we know that there could be hallucinations or incorrect statements. Next slide. So, there are top 3 benefits of claims of AI ambient devices from the companies. And as you know, it is addressing some of the provider pain points, including documentation and not taking work home or during your lunch periods. They also claim that it will streamline workflows and scheduling and billing. And indirectly, these vendors claim that it will reduce burnout in providers. But if you think about the risks, Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory notes that there's always consequences of technology adoption. There are risks with these tools. Medical records and documentation errors, as we talked about, as Meg spoke about the cybersecurity incidents and potential for keeping that stored data in clouds or extended period of time, which increases the risk, and then the mission creep, which is really making provider decisions and decision-making for the provider with these AI tools. And there are bad actors out there. As you know, in cybersecurity, they talk about harvest now and decrypt later. So we have to think about the bad actors versus the good providers and good actors. For example, there could be these hacking scenarios where, as Meg mentioned, you are exposed to subpoenas and discovery, and that's what keeps me awake at night. So I think we have a slide.
So, Alan, why am I the only one up here confused all the time? But, Alan, if a company's HIPAA compliant, I'm assuming that the misuse of PHI would be minimal. I mean, isn't that the whole idea of signing a BAA with a HIPAA-compliant company?
HIPAA standards are in place to protect patient information, yes. So let's try to poll the audience. Will you pull out your phones and go ahead and put in Slido? As you join this quiz,
Talk about HIPAA compliant.
oh, there you go.
Seriously.
Oh, goodness. I think we're getting the responders versus what is actually requiring with HIPAA. And as you're responding, all patients' data must be deleted by AI vendor at some point. True or false? That's false.
Go to the next slide
Yeah.
and see if it's there.
Let's look. Let's point. There it
Okay.
is.
Oh, yes, okay.
I need to learn how to use a slide projector. So please select what applies. Next slide.
Yeah, just wait.
There we go.
There we go.
There you go. There are your answers. Very good.
You only have 2 people so far.
All right. Come on, everybody.
This is a small sample of
Yeah, you
all
guys-
those people that put their names in there.
You were so good with the surveys and the polls.
Aren't you glad we're talking about technology?
Well, in this large sample of 2 individuals, I think what we were trying to point here, Nancy, is that there are some requirements that are clear and unclear with HIPAA. And what's important is, as any more answers come in, we're going to just keep it at that.
We're still at 2.
I have to go back?
Yeah, go back.
All right,
The
let's
bottom
see.
one. There we go.
Oh,
Okay.
you need this. Sorry, we didn't practice this part.
Oh, look at that, we're up to 3, 6, 10. We're on a roll now.
Oh, 20, all right. All right, we got almost to half the room. All right, is this slowing down?
I think you've got a pretty good
Yeah, I
sample.
think that's good, right?
Yeah.
That's a decent sample. All right, here's the data. And as we pull the data from the survey, you can kind of see to protect HPI, HIPAA requires data need to be encrypted and signed, and the BAA needs to be in place to be HIPAA compliant. And some of the survey responses, as you see there, is correct. The first one, as you notice, all patient data must be deleted by AI vendor at some point, right? I think some of you said yes or true or false, right? Data must be encrypted in transit at rest, right? Again, that could be true, and data, patient data cannot be used for for-profit purposes, but I think that's false, right? And signed business associate agreements, the BAA with cover entity must be in place, and thank you. That is true, and that's up to 76%.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So yeah, just to speak to this sort of in reference to my story, the fact, even if they had never deleted my data, that is not actually required by HIPAA. So when I say I feel that there might be some gaps here, that was something I was not legally had any protection or had no entitlement to, and definitely they have no, they're not forced to do it upon the patient's request. Like in my story, they wouldn't even speak to me. The provider was their customer and their client, and so the request had to come from their business, that partnership.
Thank you. So we talked about the risks. We looked at the data. Let me go forward. So we talked about encryption being necessary in the BAA. So I know there's legal counsel in the room and also lawyers in the room, and my disclosure will be always check with your expertise first, and some terms of that BAA and what covers and who owns that data and how it's being used and what happens if there's a breach. You cannot sell the PHI data. You cannot disclose the data to anyone who does not have absolute ownership. And you need to report data breaches and who is responsible for the investigation and reporting a breach in specific time frame. For example, for ONC, it requires that 30 days if over 500 PHI has been compromised. So think about this. As Penny mentioned earlier this morning, it was a lot easier to comply with HIPAA when we had hard patient record files. The clinical privacy terms and policy and documentation needs to be updated with new technologies. I think Meg also told me that the private practice had not updated their policies since 2004. The rise of AI is exponential in healthcare and society. As Dr. Kim Squigart mentioned earlier, if you do a Google Scholar search, the publications has blown up since ChatGPT. The average patients would not know the vulnerabilities as was Meg knew as a data scientist, but our patients trust us, and due diligence needs to be done. Most patients would think there must be some type of vendor that is a medical vendor like Epic protecting your data. However, there could be potential for high risks and misuse of the data, which are possible. think it's you, Meg. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mentioned at the end of my section that there's this business associate agreement, and my provider did not realize, well, actually didn't know what it was at first, and we had a conversation about that. But I think even more importantly, he wasn't aware that the terms in the BAA can be negotiated. So if you're a provider and you see that a company wants to keep your patient's data for 10 years, I think I was surprised that he wouldn't first ask why 10 years, or say, no, absolutely not, we're deleting this monthly. So the BAA is really a tool, but also a potential pitfall that I think a lot of providers, if they're a smaller practice without a legal and compliance team, I think I would be very intimidated putting myself in their shoes, trying to negotiate my own contract with a tech company. That sounds really scary. So I have a lot of empathy for how this could go wrong, but also a lot of empathy for the patients who might be at the receiving end of that.
So I'm sitting here, and of course you're probably watching the wheels turn around in my head because it's really very transparent. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I mean, the ethical ramifications of this whole situation. What Meg described and what I heard her saying at the beginning was just this infinite, the ultimate of the patient-therapist relationship built on trust. I mean, what she described was this extremely trusting relationship that she had with a provider in a very vulnerable situation, because you weren't just, being vulnerable in terms of the physical situation, you were sharing some very personal information. And we've all been in that situation, those that are in clinical practice, where somebody's sharing information with you that is extremely personal, and you have the obligation to, because you're entrusted with it, to protect it and to utilize it effectively within the realm of treatment. So what I'm sitting here thinking is, oh my gosh, if somebody came to me with this ethical situation, how would I kind of do an ethical analysis of what my responsibility is? So if I look at it from purely a virtues kind of perspective, how should this clinician be? What are your expectations of him? And they were built on trust. He had compassion. You wouldn't have shared with him if you didn't think he was caring and compassionate. So he had the virtues that, were essential. But then there were some virtues maybe he didn't have. He was less than transparent. He was a little bit paternalistic, just sort of like, hey, trust me, I've got this. He wasn't really exhibiting excellence because while he had the clinical part of it down, there's more to that in terms of our obligations. Just like we say to our licensees, you need to know the law. He needed to know if he's using a tool, really an aid, I mean, this is your virtual aid, you need to be responsible to the supervision of that aid. And while he delegated to the ambient scribe, we never can abdicate the responsibility, which he did. So I'm thinking, on the virtues, not quite so much, right? And in terms of consequences, if I looked at it from a consequential perspective framework, I would say, okay, here's how it should be, but what should I do? And I don't think he was looking at the consequences. I can grab all this information, it's going to save me some time. You yourself were pretty understanding of that and willing to give him that little bit of leverage. And that's excellent, but he was not taking the responsibility to look at the consequences. What ultimately is going to happen? I mean, Meg, your trust was obviously destroyed. Mm-hmm. I don't want to get too personal here, but did you think about not going back to him?
I did. It was a really tough situation for, I'd say, 3 main reasons. One was I genuinely liked this guy and cared about this guy, and friendship might be the wrong word, but I had some sort of loyalty to him, even though I knew that there was a power dynamic at play that was very much not in my favor. I still felt some sort of loyalty towards him because of the gratitude of all the hard times in my life that he had stood by me for and the ways he had helped me. And I really didn't want to be the sort of person who wrote a person off for one mistake. That was thing one. Thing two is I have a progressive condition, and my doctor had warned me that if I stopped PT, I might go downhill, and I might go downhill kind of fast. And so I didn't really know how to find another provider quickly. They wouldn't know me, they wouldn't know what I needed or what my weaknesses were. They'd have to redo the whole evaluation. Felt very overwhelming. But then the third thing, as you heard, Nancy, is that I had no power and no right to get this data deleted, and I wanted the data deleted. And the only person who could get the data deleted was the person who had given me the betrayal hives. So I kept going back to that clinic and getting more betrayal hives while hiding how I felt about this situation, because I really, really, really needed them to work with me. I needed them to work with the scribe company, but they weren't mandated to do so. So the best I could do was keep showing up as a patient for a bit and hope they would. And eventually, when the data got deleted, I decided that this therapeutic alliance had sort of broken down beyond what I felt I could repair, and I ended up moving on elsewhere. And I still feel immense gratitude for him, but the breach of trust at that point had been too grave for me to feel safe again.
So that safety and that fiduciary responsibility that we have to a patient to build the trust, but then to maintain the trust, but it goes beyond us, because finding the next provider, or in some cases, people may not be brave enough to do what you did and go back, or find another provider, and then they're not receiving the care that they need at all. And so we have a tremendous amount of power, and that power misused is abuse. And then I look at it from a purely principle perspective. You know, certainly, while he thought he was being beneficent, he actually caused harm. There was actually non-maleficence. And while he thought he was being truthful and honest, he really wasn't. So there was veracity breach. And I think what was probably the most telling to me as you were telling your story, as I was sitting here thinking, she has no autonomy. Her autonomy was completely destroyed, and we know that autonomy is the basis of that trusting relationship. So it is on us, you know, to maintain that and to be able to, if we're going to use something, it's new, we're all challenged by it, but we have a responsibility to be up with whatever is the newest. So fortunately, I guess, we have a new code of ethics that is coming out January 1st, and it does speak to our responsibility to recognize the public trust and to be up to speed. It doesn't say you need to use AI, but it says if you choose to use AI, you choose to use it in a responsible way, and I think that that's really critical for us to consider. And the other thing is that it does speak to our responsibility to maintain and to constantly have professional expertise. And we all know that the professional expertise goes beyond just the clinical treatment. It goes into the areas that we choose, our choice, again, to delegate, but never to abdicate. Our choice, if we're going to use it, is to use it responsibly, and to make sure that we have all the tools available to us to be able to do that.
So let's go back to Meg's story. So Meg ended her story whenever she said that she called the Louisiana Physical Therapy Board. So I received the message from Meg, and she told me her story, just like you all heard her story today. And what it boiled down to was there was no informed consent, and there is an issue with the protection of her protected health information. And so Meg and I talked quite a bit about this, and one of the public perceptions was that, you know, as a regulator, we are expecting our PTs to follow all state and federal guidelines out there. So therefore, we should have some sort of understanding of HIPAA and these federal guidelines that they're following. And so Meg had a lot of questions for me about HIPAA. Does HIPAA allow this? Does HIPAA allow that? And I saw a gap in my knowledge. And so I started looking into this and thinking, okay, let me see what exactly, you know, how severe this might be, because I wasn't totally sure about that, to be honest with everyone. Another thing is, Meg had a lot of questions about informed consent. You know, should he have told me? I know it's a one-party recording state. And my first response to Meg was, you know, we don't really have a definition of informed consent. We don't have it in our unprofessional conduct. We don't have it specifically, but we have pretty broad standards out there, you know, like professional standards. And if you file a complaint with the board, then the board is going to look into this, and they will make a determination. But as the executive director of the board, I don't make these determinations. So we have to have it go through the process. And they'll look at it, and they'll make a determination. And there's different ways that the complaint process can end, right? The individual may have an educational moment, or they may be disciplined, in which case it'll be public, and everyone will read the order, and they will know how to behave. But I can't guarantee the outcome. And so Meg and I talked quite a bit about this, and she said, you know, I really don't want to file a complaint on my physical therapist for several reasons. But one of the reasons is that what I'm really concerned about is that physical therapists don't know what I know about the risks of where the information could be going with these technologies. And I really want them to get the information out there. Is the only way we can get the information out there through an order that they're going to read? And so I said, well, maybe not. So then she started to ask me a few questions where she said, you know, well, what resources do you provide to your PTs? What type of guidance do you give your PTs when they're implementing this? What's your role, regulator? Like, what are you doing, right? And she said it very nicely. And so, you know, I said, well, you know, I've been to conferences and we've talked about AI, and I was more thinking of, oh, if the computer is going to start, you know, creating home exercises for patients, there needs to be a PT involved. There needs to be some PT oversight on what these computers are going to say about physical therapy. And what we were looking at here was a real-life example of AI being used. And so even though I had gone to seminars about this, I mean, I even went to AI Med in 2023, you know, saying, what should the regulators be doing? I hadn't done anything to put some guidance out there for the PTs. And so, but the other thing is, I said, let's put some guidance out, okay? Let's partner together and put some guidance out. And one way to do that is the newsletter. Let's get a newsletter article out immediately. Well, immediately means, you know, not so fast in the regulatory world, because I needed to check every source. I needed to make sure we weren't going to regulate through the newsletter. I wanted to make sure, you know, I wasn't giving advice through the newsletter. And since there were no previous cases like this that I could point to and say what the board would likely do, and I really had no, even with informed consent. I mean, aside from an AI being used, if there was a tape recorder and there wasn't consent, we had never had a case like that. So this wasn't even really about technology whenever it came to the informed consent. It was, can you record your patient without them knowing, period. So, you know, it took a little while talking to several experts and partnering with Meg on the expertise related to technology. How does the technology work? You're a data scientist. Tell me more about that. Okay, tell me how the information, whenever it goes into the cloud, would happen. Because as a regulator, I'm not necessarily an expert the board members on our board aren't necessarily experts, and then a lot of the conversation in technology, and we were talking about also, there's a lot of mom and pop shops out there, PT clinics in Louisiana. We're not worried about the big medical hospitals. They have an IT compliance team. They have a legal team. They have people reviewing this stuff. We're like, what do we get to the mom and pop shops who are like, oh my God, reimbursement's been cut. I'm looking for some time back. You know, your pajama time where you're off of work, not treating patients, you're doing all of your notes at that time. These AI tools can really help you. So what are we doing to help the PTs use those successfully rather than just going after them whenever they don't? So we put out a newsletter, and that's on our website, and it was 7 pages. So it was Meg's story along with a checklist of it. Before you sign up with an AI vendor, here are some questions to ask that vendor. And then we recreated the newsletter into a very short video for people who don't like to read that much. And then in addition to that, Meg worked with me on, you know, basically kind of like a Mad Lib resource for our PTs in the state where it has blanks, where it would say, hi, I'm your therapist, you know, I'm using this tool made by blank. It's going to, you know, record your information and store it for blank years. So even aside from whenever you're signing up for these AI tools, it gives you another one of those, hey, these are things I need to be thinking about. And the newsletter kind of tells you why you would be thinking about those things. And so some positive things came out of this in Louisiana. And I think that this is a true testament to how we can engage our consumers. Consumers have expertise, and they have knowledge. And some of that expertise and knowledge can help us in our regulatory role to provide guidance that can keep our licensees from having a violation. And this is a perfect example of how we could do that. And so that was sort of an exciting partnership that we had, and we were able to produce some good guidance for the citizens in Louisiana. And then also being able to be at forums like this, you know, where we can talk to the regulators. So we're thinking of other opportunities where we can get the ideas out there to PTs and try to help them. With that, I will turn it back over to Meg.
Yeah, so in conclusion, just tying this all up, I told you at the beginning that it's pretty difficult to cramp my style, and I think that's true. But also, I face a lot of challenges, and I can't do that alone, and I can't fight some of these challenges alone. PT has helped me more than I can possibly describe in this moment. PT has allowed me to continue doing things that I love to do, that doctors have told me I would lose my ability to do. So in some ways, I've really defied my prognosis because of the physical therapists that I've had. And so these photos are just, I'm still running, even though I'm in bilateral AFOs, and did pretty well in a race, so there's that. So to all the PTs in the room right now, thank you for what you do. It is life-changing, and I hope that you have the same quality of life that you're able to give me, and I hope that you are able to reduce that pajama time through great use of tools that can help all of us. And so we're speaking today because we feel that it needs to help everyone, the patient and the provider. I'm also not anti-technology in any way. I'm quite pro-technology. Even with all the physical therapy I've had, my legs don't work so well. And there are technologies that can actually help me do even better with more information and possibly tools to help me function. So these photos are, I'm currently partnering with a physical therapy college in our state who's doing a little bit of a study on my running to try to figure out what muscles I'm using to compensate for my weaknesses and how I can be even more efficient. And this is an example of how technology, even above and beyond sort of traditional therapy techniques, can really push us forward. So despite all the scary things we and I said up here, I want to clarify that I don't think that technology is scary. I think technology is wonderful, and I think technology is going to open new horizons for all of us. but it's advancing really fast right now. And it is advancing fast in a way that, frankly, me as a patient, I don't feel completely safe because I don't feel that the regulations and the protections in the code have caught up with how quickly technology is advancing. So thank you also to the regulators in the room, because I really appreciate your role, and can't say enough how my faith in humanity was restored when my email reached Charlotte's desk and she responded in the way she did, and we developed that partnership. So, in conclusion, I was in a very, very vulnerable position, as you heard. Like I described, I was in the bottom rung of a whole power ladder, and I could not climb up that ladder. But I'm far from the most vulnerable patient out there. I had the education to recognize when something smelled a little fishy. I had the stubbornness and the lack of social graces that allowed me to annoy people until I got answers. And now I have been given the opportunity by FSBPT to use my voice and to speak today. And that's giving me some power back, so thank you. But please think of all the patients who aren't me, don't have that education, don't have this voice right now. And I hope that I am speaking for them as well, and that this is a discussion that is just starting. Thank you very much.
That's for you.
Oh, no, it's all of us.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you for sharing your story. We know it was not easy, and it certainly, I think, was life-changing for all of us. We do have, I believe, a few minutes for questions. There's mics around there. Anybody have any questions they would, clarification? I thought
Jason
you were just
Kaiser.
going there to fix the mic.
Is it working? All right. Jason Kaiser, I'm the administrator from California. And I guess first and foremost, what I would say, Ms. O'Connor, is just thank you for being here. People that know me in the room would probably tell you, I'm a tech guy, right? But I think I've probably told a few of this. I'm a tech guy because I'm kind of scared of tech, right? I might have 3 or 4 wearables on me at any one time. I might have 1 or 2 Alexas in every room of my house, right? But I'm also on top of my privacy concerns. I'm also looking at the settings. And the more I read, the more I acquire, the more certain I am that I know nothing, right? And so I would just say, this hits home in such a way that it's in an area, in a field that's all familiar to us, but you have this in every aspect of your lifestyle, and you should be aware of that too. And the same advice that I give to consumers is just that basic caveat emptor, buyer beware. So, and again, thank you.
If I can just respond to that really quickly, I meant to say earlier, I think we all sort of have this sense that privacy is dead because of exactly what you're saying. We all have this sense that our phones are already listening all the time, and our Garmins know exactly where we've been today. And I think that gives a sense of fatalism or futility to a lot of people, and I would just say, does that have to apply to healthcare? Does that have to apply to a discussion that happens behind a closed door in a medical provider's office? Because it's a slippery slope, but that can always end somewhere, and we can choose that that doesn't trickle into that closed door room.
Hi, I'm Catherine Dower from California, and first of all, thank you. Huge kudos to all of you on the panel. I wanted to ask about guidelines for consumers. So I come from a public protection perspective, and I really appreciate, Charlotte, your comments about setting up some guidelines or recommendations for the therapists. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts, and then I would ask the rest of the panelists as well, including Meg, what might we develop for consumers? Because I've been sitting in those rooms, medical offices with, either by myself or with my parents or elderly, when the doctor or the provider says, I'm using AI, is that okay? And everybody just looks around at each other and nods without having a set of questions that we could ask to know what our rights might be, because we are in vulnerable positions usually. So anyway, that's my question. Any thoughts would be appreciated. Thank you. And thank you again for sharing your story. It's really touching.
I don't think that we actually discussed that, and I love that idea. I think that that's a wonderful idea and very smart, and I think that we've said that that needs to happen, but just didn't talk about doing anything about it. So thank you for saying to do something about it, because down the road we would have thought of that at some point, but now it'll be a lot quicker. The other thing that I'll say about that, particularly in PT clinics. So one thing whenever Meg and I were talking, she said, when I go to my dermatologist, I don't tell my dermatologist all the things I tell my PT. And sorry that I disclosed that you go to a dermatologist, Meg.
HIPAA violation.
Another one.
I don't know why. She goes, but anyway, so yes, but the point is, when you go to other healthcare providers, you might not be as chatty. Just like with sexual misconduct, and we give PTs a license to touch people. PTs have a unique type of relationship with their patients that involve a lot of conversation, more so than some other providers. I'm not going to say all other providers, but some other providers. So having a question list for patients for PT clinics, I think, is a great idea and where it should start, actually.
I love that idea, and I love the idea of a consumer awareness campaign that could happen in the office. It could happen, be initiated from the board. It certainly should be in our educational programs. That very close juxtaposition between being friendly, we're all friendly as PTs, and being a friend, and making sure we don't cross those boundaries.
And I guess I would just add that for that consumer report, when you're looking at AI vendors, just ask for what are the limitations, what is the BAA, and do you have any consumer, key points that I could share with consumers when I use this tool? So it's up to the provider to ask those questions, and that would be a good checklist.
And I'll just add, after what happened to me the first time, you may be surprised to hear that I have actually agreed to someone recording me with an ambient listening scribe in another context. They asked for permission. I said, what is the company? I said, I'm going to go home and look it up, and I'll give you an answer next time I see you. Please turn it off right now. I went home, I looked up that company's policies, compared them to the other one. The things I cared about as a patient, in case you were ever in this situation, you're wondering, what should you care about? Doesn't have to be the same things as me. But I wanted my name off the data, so that's de-identification. If you're going to store it, don't keep my name on it, please. And secondly, I want ensured automatic deletion of all that sort of extemporaneous extra stuff. The transcripts and the audio recordings. I don't know if you guys have ever heard your voice on a recording and wanted to bury your head 10 feet down in the sand, but just thinking of that existing out there forever gives me the heebie-jeebies. So I want to know that every month they delete everything they recorded in the past month after confirming that the SOAP notes are validated. Things like that.
Great.
Craig Miller from Michigan. Thank you very much for sharing your story, given your background. And you had mentioned about there being a bit of a slippery slope, and there's a wide range of AI support that's out there in healthcare. Kind of from the standpoint of an ambient listening device to maybe just searching for help and supporting exercise or care plans for practice. Your thoughts on kind of the difference between say a disclosure versus a consent versus an informed consent, depending upon how AI or how intrusive maybe an AI device might be.
Anybody?
That's a really good question. I think from my perspective, and this is a question I need to think about a little bit more to give you a good answer from my perspective, but just in the interest of discussion, I think as a patient, the reason I felt, Nancy's referred to autonomy multiple times now, and I think that is the crux of it, that I felt my autonomy had been taken away by not being able to opt out. And furthermore, by not being able to modulate what I was saying, even if I had opted in, because I might have told him certain things in a different way, or I might have told him different things. So I think when autonomy is in question, informed consent is necessary, not just something sandwiched in the NPP, which again didn't even happen in my case, but I think a true discussion and a true explanation of the risks and benefits is required. I think for some support technologies that reasonably don't call the patient's autonomy into question, I would still be in favor of disclosure for basically anything that sends data anywhere that isn't the clinic. In the same way as if you took a picture of someone, maybe they're in the background of the picture, maybe you took a picture of your clinic and someone's in the background using a TheraBand, you're gonna say, hey, you're in this picture that we wanna put on our Facebook, is that cool? And it would be a little weird if you didn't do that. So I think anytime anything leaves your clinic in any definition of that word, disclosure's good, required, maybe not legally required, but I would say ethically required, and informed consent is better. But I think Nancy, anyone here
Yeah,
can.
I think informed consent is the crux of autonomy, and autonomy is the crux of respect. So disclosure is definitely required ethically. So I think there's not even a question there. I think we have one more question.
Yes, Krista Boyd, Nevada. Meg, thank you so much for sharing your story. And Charlotte, thank you so much for acknowledging your lack in knowledge of the HIPAA stuff and being willing to research and then get together and collaborate to make that resource. I'm looking for thoughts on a starting point for regulation. If we can regulate like the BAAs that go into place in each clinic in our state, requiring something like data to be deleted automatically or deleted monthly. I just was looking for thoughts of like a starting point.
Whoa, well, I wouldn't even like touch that one in terms of our regulatory authority there, but maybe.
Right. So one great thing about coming to FSBPT is that we can talk to each other about what regulations people already may have in place, right? And so one of the things whenever I was coming here, our board is looking at rule changes and putting some information, not, I don't know if you're talking about the state statute or in the Practice Act, but we're looking at putting some language in the Practice Act under unprofessional conduct and just to give some more guidance in the regulation as well after informed consent. And I was struggling with this as well because we have a scenario that we can look at and say, okay, what teeth would we have should a complaint had been filed and the board wanted to do something about this? Where are the gaps? And without being completely specific about it so that we can allow it to adapt with time. So in doing that, I think that our CBA has a forum and communicating and, there with ideas for regulation. It's so early. I don't think there's any model regulation related to this, but I do think that it's something that, especially after this talk, will be in interest of the regulators in the room looking at that. I don't know if that was helpful.
I think one last question.
I was just curious, and I want to thank you all for bringing this to our attention, and thank you for your story, Ms. O'Connor, as well. That was very telling. It's all good to go ahead and see that the practices or the policies of company are in place, but I'm wondering if any thought has been put into who's going to audit, that they're following up with what they say. I know, like with research, human subject information is very protected, but the actual funding agencies will actually have audits to make sure that folks are in compliance. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that.
In terms of auditing, I think in a way with that BAA and the vendor, they're supposed to encrypt and also report on breaches. And obviously that's part of the auditing process, and you want to, as a provider, make sure that they're doing those things and following up. As a provider, just to looking at transcription of your notes, you really need to kind of think about, is that really saving practice time? And so therefore you need to kind of audit it that way, and then also see if those outcomes are actually there in terms of saving time and again, some of the mission creep we mentioned.
Yeah, and I think the audit ultimately kind of, for some of these things, is going to come down to us, because once that note comes back to you, hallucination-free hopefully, you're signing it, and that's the ultimate audit, is your signature. So while the companies are large and maybe a little bit out of our control, our personal audit and responsibility is there, and I just got the stop sign, so we're out of here.